Another truck groaned beside her barn, tipping shattered piano soundboards onto 12 years' splintered waste, while unpaid bills waited inside. She had begged factory managers to stop, yet every load kept coming. Then one cracked panel caught sunlight differently, showing tight grain beneath the damage. That moment changed everything. Instead of hauling debris away, this single mother began saving usable sections, shaping them into kitchen boards customers would later gladly pay for. Those discarded pieces built a $400,000 cutting board brand. Before we see how, tell us where you're watching from, because opportunity sometimes arrives looking exactly like trash. Trash was exactly what everyone else called it, and for years she had believed them. The broken soundboards lay behind the barn in warped stacks, some split down the middle, others scarred where metal braces had been removed at the factory. Rain darkened the edges, dust filled the cracks, a few pieces had started to curl. Still, after noticing that one clean strip beneath the damage, she began looking at the pile differently. The next morning, she dragged 3 panels into the barn and brushed them off with an old broom. Beneath the grime, the wood looked nothing like cheap lumber sold at the hardware store. Some boards showed pale, straight grain. Others carried darker lines, tight rings, and smooth faces that had once been chosen for sound, strength, and stability. She didn't know much about piano building, but she knew enough to recognize good wood when she saw it. Her first test was simple. She cut around the worst cracks with a borrowed circular saw, trimmed away nail holes, then ran a small section across an aging planer a neighbor had let her use. The surface changed instantly. Gray, dirty waste became clean wood with a warm shine. That surprised her. She started sorting the pile by what could be saved. Wide sections went into one stack. Narrow strips went into another. Pieces with deep splits were kept aside for smaller projects. Every evening, after dinner and chores, she spent another hour pulling usable wood from material the factory had written off years earlier. There was one problem. She still had no product. Selling raw strips would barely cover gas. Firewood would waste the best pieces. Furniture required tools, space, and skill she didn't have. Then, while slicing vegetables on a thin plastic board, she looked down at the knife marks covering its surface. A cutting board. It was small enough to build in the barn, useful enough for any home, and simple enough for her to test without buying equipment. She returned outside with a tape measure, picked 6 pieces from the stack, and carried them inside. Her first design wasn't beautiful. The strips didn't match. 2 edges sat uneven, and one corner had a hairline crack she had missed. But when she wiped mineral oil across the finished surface, the grain came alive, and for the first time, the waste looked like something someone might actually buy. Buy was still a hopeful word, because nobody had paid her a cent yet. The next afternoon, she carried that first board into a small feed store, where local families often stopped for tools, seed, and coffee. The owner turned it over twice, ran a thumb along the uneven corner, then smiled. "It's different," he said, "but different doesn't always mean sellable." That stung. She went home and made another one, then another. One warped overnight, a second split near the handle. The third looked better, but glue squeezed through one seam and dried like a scar across the edge. Each mistake cost time she barely had, yet every failure showed her what needed fixing. Would you have kept going after 3 bad tries? If you enjoy stories about people who turn hard breaks into second chances, subscribe, because this was where her real change began. Instead of rushing, she slowed down. She cut farther away from old cracks. She matched strips by thickness before gluing them. A neighbor showed her how to clamp the pieces evenly, and she learned to sand with the grain, rather than fight it. Small changes made a huge difference. One evening, she laid 5 narrow strips beside 2 darker pieces, and noticed something she hadn't planned. The contrast looked beautiful. Rather than hiding the fact that the board came from several broken soundboards, she made that patchwork part of the design. Her daughter walked into the barn and stopped. "Mom, that one actually looks expensive." She laughed. "That's the nicest thing anybody said all week." The next Saturday, she took 6 finished boards to a church craft sale. She expected people to glance, smile, and move on. Instead, one man asked where the wood came from. "Old piano soundboards," she told him. "The factory threw them away." He picked up the largest board again. "You mean this used to be inside a piano?" That question changed the whole conversation. Soon, people weren't only touching the smooth finish. They were asking about the cracks, the factory, the age of the wood, and how she saved it. By noon, 4 boards were gone. The final buyer held hers against the light and said, "You shouldn't sell these like ordinary cutting boards." For the first time, she understood why. The wood had a past, and that past might be worth more than the lumber itself could be. That past became the part people remembered. At the next market, she stopped describing her work as reclaimed wood and started telling customers exactly what they were holding. Each board had once been cut for a piano, rejected after a crack appeared, then dumped behind her barn with hundreds of others. Suddenly, shoppers leaned closer. One woman bought 2 for wedding gifts. A retired teacher ordered another for his daughter. Someone asked whether she could leave a small factory mark visible near the edge, instead of sanding it away. That request gave her another idea. Whenever a safe section carried an old stamp, pencil number, or inspection mark, she tried to preserve it. Those tiny signs proved the wood had lived another life, before reaching a kitchen. No 2 boards looked exactly alike, and customers began choosing pieces based on grain, shade, or whatever little mark made one feel personal. Soon, ordinary rectangles weren't enough. She experimented with striped patterns, rounded corners, juice grooves, and handles cut into thicker pieces. Darker strips went between pale ones to make the surface stand out. Narrow scraps became cheese boards. Short offcuts turned into serving blocks rather than landing in the burn pile. Orders followed. At first, neighbors called. Then friends of buyers contacted her. Photos started moving through local Facebook groups, and people who had never visited her town wanted boards shipped across state lines. "How many can you make?" one customer asked. She looked around the barn and almost laughed. 12 years of soundboards stood behind her. The problem was no longer finding wood. It was keeping up. Evenings stretched later. Sawdust covered her boots. Shipping boxes filled one corner. Clamps crowded another, and handwritten order notes hung from a nail beside the workbench. Her children helped wrap finished pieces after homework, while she checked every surface for rough spots before anything left the barn. Still, she refused to turn the boards into something cheap. The factory had called the wood defective, but her buyers weren't paying for perfection from a lumberyard. They wanted character. They wanted craftsmanship. Most of all, they wanted the story. So she printed a small card for every order explaining where the material came from and why each piece looked different. That simple card changed how customers saw the product. They weren't buying another kitchen tool anymore. They were taking home part of a piano that never got to make music. That unfinished music became the heart of her brand, giving every finished board a story customers could carry into their own homes daily. But growing demand brought a harder problem. She couldn't keep treating every order like a one-off project made after supper. If this business was going to support her family, she needed a system, so she started sorting every soundboard before cutting anything. Wide, clean sections went into premium boards. Narrow strips were saved for striped designs. Pieces with small cracks became serving boards, handles, or smaller kitchen pieces. Anything too damaged for food use was set aside instead of forcing it into a product. That one change saved hours. She measured her best sellers and picked a few standard sizes. Instead of guessing each time, she cut batches together, glued similar patterns at once, and sanded several boards in the same session. A simple notebook tracked which design sold fastest, how much wood each one used, and what customers were willing to pay. She labeled shelves, stacked blanks by size, and kept finished orders separate from stock. Then came the biggest lesson. Free wood didn't mean cheap products. Her boards took time to inspect, cut, glue, sand, oil, package, and ship. More important, buyers weren't comparing them to discount boards at a big box store. They were buying something handcrafted from reclaimed piano wood, with grain and history no factory-made copy could match. She raised her prices. Orders didn't stop. They grew. Gift shops wanted small batches. Online buyers ordered wedding presents, anniversary gifts, and housewarming sets. A regional kitchen store asked for a wholesale price. Suddenly, the pile behind her barn wasn't an eyesore. It was inventory. She also learned not to waste the waste. Short strips became cheese boards. Thin pieces became trivets. Attractive offcuts were saved for handles and accents. Every usable inch had a purpose, which meant each dumped soundboard could create several products instead of one. That was where the real money appeared, not in finding something free, in building a repeatable process around something overlooked. Over time, those choices pushed sales higher than she had ever imagined. The brand passed 6 figures, then kept climbing until total revenue crossed $400,000. She stood behind the barn one evening, looking at the same cracked stacks that had annoyed her for 12 years. Nothing about the wood had changed, only the way she saw it. Now the rest of town began to see the discarded wood differently, because her work revealed what everyone had missed. The factory workers who once watched trucks dump cracked soundboards behind her barn began asking what she made from them. Neighbors who had joked about the growing pile stopped laughing when delivery boxes started leaving every week. She never made a speech about proving anyone wrong. There was no need. Customers did that for her. Photos arrived from kitchens in Texas, Ohio, Tennessee, and California. One buyer sent a picture of a board sitting beside a wedding cake. Another wrote that his father had repaired pianos for 40 years, so the gift meant more than any store-bought present could have. Those messages mattered because they showed her the product had become bigger than reclaimed wood. It carried memory. As orders increased, she hired local help for sanding, packing, and shipping. She bought better tools, improved the barn workspace, and built shelves where finished boards could cure before going out. What had started with a borrowed saw and one uneven cutting board now ran on schedules, order sheets, and steady work. Even the piano factory changed its attitude. Instead of treating the soundboards like a problem somebody else had to deal with, managers began stacking the cleaner rejects separately. They knew she could use them. The piles behind the barn slowly became more organized, and fewer good pieces were ruined by weather before she could inspect them. That change felt almost funny. For 12 years, she had wanted the dumping to stop. Now she wanted the right pieces saved. Still, the biggest victory was not the $400,000 in sales, the wholesale accounts, or the customers waiting for new designs. It was the security those boards created inside her home. Bills were paid on time. Repairs no longer caused panic. Her children had watched their mother build something from a problem everyone else ignored. Years earlier, each truck had sounded like another burden arriving. Now the same kind of load meant material, orders, and another month of work. She walked past the remaining stacks one evening and ran her hand across a cracked panel. Once, that split had meant failure. To the factory, it still did. Someone rejected it once, but rejection had become the beginning of everything she built. To her, it meant the wood was ready for its second life. That second chance proved value could still survive rejection. Those cracked piano soundboards never made music, yet they helped one mother build security, purpose, and a $400,000 brand. If you enjoy stories about overlooked opportunities turning into something remarkable, subscribe for more rural stories like this.